7 times. The man said loud enough for the whole town to hear. And not one of them wanted you. Clara Bennett did not flinch. She did not cry. She stood on that platform in Red Valley Ridge and let the words hit her like stones, because she had learned long ago that a woman who bleeds in public gives the crowd exactly what they came for. If this story moves you, if you've ever been overlooked, passed over, or left standing alone, subscribe to our channel and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The selection platform in Red Valley Ridge was built from weathered pine and old ambition 12 feet wide, raised 3 steps above the dirt, positioned at the center of town, where everyone could see and no one could pretend they hadn't watched. Clara Bennett had stood on platforms like this before. 6 times before in 6 different towns across the Wyoming Territory. She had walked up those steps with her back straight and her chin level and her hands folded quietly at her waist. 6 times she had waited. 6 times a man had looked her over, the way a rancher inspects a horse at auction, checking her teeth with his eyes, measuring her hips, calculating her usefulness, and 6 times the answer had come back the same. No, not you, not this one. She was 31 years old, which in 1883, Wyoming might as well have been ancient. She had dark auburn hair that she kept pinned tight because loose hair on a selection day read as desperation, and she had green eyes that people sometimes called striking, in the same tone they used to call a storm. Striking something to be noted, and then gotten away from. She was not small and soft and agreeable. She was lean from work and precise in her speech, and she had the particular kind of stillness that women develop when they have spent years making themselves smaller and finally stopped. That stillness, she had learned, was the thing that cost her every time. Men on the frontier wanted warmth they could see immediately. They wanted a woman who smiled quickly and deferred often and filled silence with reassurance. They did not want a woman who held her ground like she owned it. Clara held her ground like she owned it. The morning of her 7th selection, she had risen before dawn in the room she was renting above the Red Valley Ridge General Store, 40 cents a night, which was the last of what she had. And she had looked at herself in the cracked mirror above the washstand and said out loud to no one, "This is the last time." She had meant it as resolve. Standing there now with the crowd gathered 3 deep on both sides of the main street and the October wind cutting through her wool coat, like it had a personal grievance, she understood it might simply be fact. The rancher currently considering her was named Horace Dunbar. He was 52, red-faced, with the particular posture of a man who had been told he was important often enough to believe it. He walked a slow circle around her the way they all did, and Clara kept her eyes forward and her breathing even and her hands absolutely still. "How old?" Dunbar asked, addressing the town registrar rather than Clara herself, because asking the woman directly was apparently too complicated. 31, said the registrar, a thin man named Peters, who always looked like he'd smelled something unpleasant. Dunbar made a sound in his throat. "Previous placements? 6. All declined." That sent a ripple through the crowd. Clara heard it, not words exactly, just a shift in the collective breath of 80 people absorbing information and rearranging their opinions accordingly. 6 prior rejections was not news in Red Valley Ridge. Everyone in town had known it before she climbed these steps. But hearing it said out loud in the formal cadence of official record gave it a different weight. It made her a statistic. "What's wrong with her?" a woman's voice called from somewhere in the crowd. "Not unkind particularly, just curious. The way people are curious about a wagon with a broken wheel, not their problem, but interesting to look at." Clara did not turn toward the voice. Dunbar completed his circle. He stopped in front of her and looked at her face for a long moment, and she looked back at him with the same expression she would use to observe weather on the horizon. Neutral, measuring, unmoved. "Can you cook?" he asked. "Yes." "So?" "Yes." "You ever worked cattle?" "I have." He raised his eyebrows slightly at that. Most women at selection said no to cattle work, understanding instinctively that admitting competence in ranch labor was not the femininity men were purchasing. Clara had stopped performing incompetence somewhere around rejection number 4. "Why'd the others turn you down?" Dunbar asked, and there it was. The question that always came, always phrased as if the problem must be catalogued, and explained as if she were a piece of defective merchandise that needed its flaws disclosed before the buyer made a final decision. Clara took one breath. "You'd have to ask them." Dunbar's eyes narrowed. "I'm asking you, and I told you ask them. I know what I bring to a household and a ranch. What I don't know is why 6 different men decided it wasn't enough. That's their accounting to make, not mine." The crowd went very quiet. Horace Dunbar looked at her for a long, flat moment. Then he turned to Peters and said, "No," and stepped off the platform and walked away without looking back. The quiet held for about 3 seconds. Then it broke open into 100 small conversations, whispers threading through the crowd like water finding the lowest ground, and Clara stood on the platform alone and heard the word rejected pass from mouth to mouth like a coin being counted. She did not move immediately. She had learned that moving too fast looked like fleeing, and she would not give Red Valley Ridge the satisfaction of watching her flee. So she stood for 10 full seconds. She counted them deliberately, 1 to 10, and then she descended the steps with the same measured pace she had used climbing them, and turned to collect her traveling bag from beside the registrar's table. "Miss Bennett." Peter's voice was almost gentle. "Almost. The noon stage departs at 12:30. If you need the fare recorded against the Territory Relief Fund." "I don't," Clara said. She didn't have the fare, but she would walk out of Red Valley Ridge before she let it go on her record as charity. She had her bag over her shoulder and was 3 steps from the platform when she heard the first one. 7 times. A man's voice, not directed at her, directed at a companion, but pitched to Carrie. 7 times and not one taker. There's got to be something fundamentally broken about a woman like that. She stopped. Not because the words hurt, they did, but pain was not the reason she stopped. She stopped because something in her chest drew tight, and then tighter, and she understood suddenly that if she kept walking, kept absorbing, kept placing the next foot forward with her face composed and her silence intact, she was going to arrive at the edge of this town and simply cease. Not die. Cease. Become nothing. Become exactly what 7 rejections were slowly insisting she was. She turned around. The man who had spoken was maybe 40, in a good coat, standing with 2 other men near the front of the dispersing crowd. He had the easy posture of someone who had never once doubted his right to say things out loud. "Say it again," Clara said. He blinked. "Beg your pardon." "You said there must be something fundamentally broken about a woman like me." Her voice was even. "Say it again. To my face, not my back." The crowd had not entirely dispersed. Those nearest stopped. Those farther away turned back. Human beings are drawn to the possibility of spectacle the way flies are drawn to sweetness they cannot help themselves. The man in the good coat smiled the particular smile of a man who believes embarrassing a woman is the same as winning an argument. "I meant no offense, ma'am, just observing facts." "The fact," Clara said, "is that Horace Dunbar spent 4 minutes walking circles around me and decided I was too much trouble. That's his fact. It says nothing about my value and everything about his tolerance for a woman who answers a question directly." She looked at him steadily. "You want a fact about me? Here's one. I have been standing on platforms in this territory for 2 years. I have been poked at and assessed and found wanting by men who couldn't manage their own herds without hired hands doing the thinking. And I am still here, still standing, still speaking in full sentences." She tilted her head slightly. "What's your name?" The man blinked again, wrong-footed now. "Garrett. Tom Garrett." "Mr. Garrett, come back to this platform in 10 years and tell me what you've built, and I'll tell you what I've built, and we'll see whose accounting reads as broken." She turned and walked away from him. The crowd watched her go in complete silence. She made it to the edge of town before the shaking started. Not visible, nothing that anyone walking past would see. just her hands curled tight around the strap of her, trembling faintly against the leather. She found the water trough at the far end of the main street and stood beside it and breathed through her nose for a count of 20, waiting for her body to remember that she was not in fact in danger. 7. 7 times. She did the mathematics she always did in the aftermath, the brutal, honest arithmetic that she permitted herself only when no one was watching. She was 31. Selection registers in Wyoming Territory closed at 35, after which a woman was considered unplaceable and removed from the rolls. That gave her 4 years. 4 years and no money and a traveling bag with 2 dresses, 1 pair of boots, a Bible she no longer read, and $11 she had been rationing since Casper. $11 was not enough to get anywhere that mattered. She could try to find work in Red Valley Ridge. Laundry, perhaps? Cooking at the hotel. Something that would earn enough to move her to the next town, which would give her the opportunity to stand on another platform and be rejected again, which would give her the opportunity. She pressed her forehead against the cold wood of the trough post and let herself have 5 seconds of absolute despair. Just 5. She had learned to ration despair the same way she rationed money, a little at a time, strictly controlled, never allowed to compound. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. She straightened up. She turned to face the road that led south out of Red Valley Ridge, already calculating distance and daylight when she heard the horse. Not horses. One horse. Moving at a deliberate pace, the kind of pace that comes from a rider who is not in a hurry, because a rider who owns the land doesn't need to hurry. The hoofbeats were unhurried and heavy, and they were coming directly toward her. Clara stepped to the side of the road. The rider did not slow down, did not speed up, kept coming at that same settled, deliberate pace until he pulled up perhaps 10 feet from where she stood, and she looked up at the man on the horse and felt for the first time that morning genuinely uncertain. He was somewhere in his late 30s, dark-haired with the kind of face that had been weathered rather than aged, strong-lined, spare of expression, the sort of face that had been looked at by wind and sun for so long, it had stopped bothering to disguise itself as anything other than what it was. He sat a horse the way certain men sit horses, like the animal was simply a continuation of himself rather than a thing he was riding. A dark hat, good leather gloves, a coat that had seen work. He was looking at her. Not the way Dunbar had looked at her. Not the assessment, the audit, the inventory of her useful qualities. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something he is trying to understand. "Clara Bennett," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "Jack Callahan." He said it the same way, not an introduction, just a fact being placed on the table between them. "I own the Callahan Ranch. North Quarter up to the ridgeline. 40,000 acres. Clara said nothing. She waited. "I heard what you said to Tom Garrett," Callahan said. "Half the town heard what I said to Tom Garrett. I heard it from the other end of Main Street." Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. "I was on my way to the platform." Clara looked at him. "The selection closed. Dunbar was the last registered rancher." "I'm not registered." A beat of silence. "Then why were you on your way to the platform?" she asked. Jack Callahan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said simply, "For you." The words landed in the cold air between them and stayed there. Clara's first instinct was suspicion. Her second instinct was also suspicion. She had lived 31 years in a world that occasionally dressed cruelty in the costume of generosity, and she had learned to check the seams before she accepted the gift. "You don't know me," she said. "I know what I saw." "You saw a woman get rejected on a public platform." "I saw a woman get rejected on a public platform," he said, "and then turn around and hold her ground in front of 80 people who were expecting her to disappear quietly." He tilted his head slightly. "That's not nothing." "That's observation," Clara said. "That's not knowing someone." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He didn't seem troubled by this. "I have a ranch that needs a capable person. I have 40 men who would eat me alive if I brought them someone who couldn't handle pressure. And I've watched 6 women get placed on ranches in this territory in the past 2 years, and 3 of them were gone inside a season because they weren't built for the work." He looked at her steadily. "You've been standing on platforms for 2 years. That means 2 years of being told you're not enough, and you're still standing." Clara held her ground. "You're describing endurance, not character." "In my experience," Callahan said, "endurance at that scale is character." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back without flinching, without filling the silence, without doing any of the things that men usually did when they were trying to convince a woman of something. The leaning and the softening of the voice, the performance of warmth, calculated to disarm. He just waited. It occurred to her distantly that she had never met a man who was comfortable with silence the same way she was comfortable with silence. "What are you actually offering?" she asked. "A position at my ranch. Room, board, fare, wages to start. If it works out, if we suit each other in terms of working partnership, then a formal arrangement." He paused. "Marriage, if you want that. A legal agreement that protects your position on the land if you don't." "You're not offering romance," she said flatly. "No," he said. "I'm offering something more useful." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do you get from this?" The ghost of that almost smile again. "A capable person." 40,000 acres, she said. 40 men. You could hire any number of capable people. "I could," he agreed. "I have. They come and go. Men who are capable at easy work and fall apart when it gets hard." He looked at her. "I need someone who doesn't fall apart." "You've known me for 4 minutes. 3 minutes and 40 seconds, he said. "And in that time you've asked me 5 direct questions without apologizing for any of them." He shifted slightly in the saddle. "Miss Bennett, I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to make a practical decision. If you want to walk south down that road and take your chances on the next town, I won't stop you. But if you want to see the Callahan Ranch before you decide anything, I'll take you there. No strings, no obligation. You see it, you decide it's not for you. I'll put you on the next stage myself with enough for the fare." Clara looked at the road south. She looked back at Jack Callahan. "I have conditions," she said. "Tell me. Time before any formal arrangement. A minimum of 3 months where I am an employee, not a prospective wife. During that time, the financial agreement is in writing and signed. If I choose to leave at any point, I leave with what I've earned and no claim made against me." She paused. "I'm not a woman who makes decisions under pressure, Mr. Callahan. If you want me at your ranch, you'll wait for my decision to be mine." Callahan looked at her. Then he said, "All right." No argument. No attempt to negotiate a softer version of her terms. Just all right, as if she had asked for something perfectly reasonable, which she had, but which she had never before had the experience of a man treating as such. She stood there for a moment, recalibrating. "You agree to that easily," she said, "because those are fair terms." He said it simply. "I don't make arrangements I don't intend to honor." Most men would try to reduce the timeline, or argue the financial clause. I'm not most men. She looked at him. He held her gaze, and it was steady and level, and there was something in it she couldn't name yet. Not warmth exactly, not interest exactly. Something more complicated and more honest than either. "I'll need to collect my bag," she said. "I see it on your shoulder." "Then I'm ready," Clara said. They rode north out of Red Valley Ridge with the town watching. Clara sat behind Callahan on the horse. There had been a brief practical negotiation about this that she had won by pointing out that his horse was fresh, and it was 4 miles, and she had already walked 2, and she kept her hands at her sides rather than holding his coat the way he'd suggested, because she had not yet decided how much she trusted this man, and she wasn't going to signal otherwise with her body before her mind had caught up. The town watched them go. She could feel the weight of 80 pairs of eyes at her back, and she imagined with a precision that was probably too accurate to be entirely healthy, the conversations already happening behind those eyes. He chose her, Callahan chose her, out of all of them, he came back for the one nobody wanted. She imagined Tom Garrett standing somewhere on that main street with his good coat and his easy posture watching her ride north with the richest man in the territory, and trying to reconcile that image with the inventory he had already completed of her worth. She hoped it bothered him for a long time. "You're quiet," Callahan said. "You said that like it surprises you." "I said it like I noticed." Clara held on to the side of the saddle as they took a slight grade. "I'm thinking about whether this is a mistake." "Fair thing to think about." "And about what you get from this," she continued. "Not the explanation you gave me. The actual thing." He was quiet for a moment. The horse picked its way along the frozen mud track, unhurried. "I've been running that ranch alone for 6 years," Callahan said finally. "I'm good at it. The land is good. The operation is solid." A pause. "But there's a kind of work that can't get done by someone who's afraid to push back. I need someone who won't fold when I'm wrong." Clara considered this. "You're describing a partner." "Yes. Most men don't want that. Most men," he said, "haven't made the mistakes I've made managing 40,000 acres alone." She looked at the back of his head, the set of his shoulders, the particular stillness of a man who was not performing ease but actually possessed it. "What mistakes?" she asked. He turned his head slightly. "You'll see them when we get there." The Callahan Ranch announced itself before it was visible. First it was the smell cattle and hay and wood smoke, the particular combination of a working operation that had been working for a long time. Then it was the sound, the low frequency of a place with 40 men in it, hammering and calling and moving stock. And then it was the gate, which was a simple structure. 2 upright posts with the name burned into a crossbeam. Callahan. No flourish, just the name. The men noticed them before they reached the main yard. Clara watched it happen, the gradual orientation, one man nudging another, conversations, stopping work, pausing, faces turning. By the time Callahan drew the horse to a stop in the center of the yard, there were perhaps 15 men visible, and every one of them was looking at her. She had expected the looking. She had not expected the particular quality of it. It was not the assessment she had experienced on the selection platform. It was something harder, more territorial. These men had built their lives around this ranch, around this operation, around this man on this horse, and the question moving behind their eyes was not what is she worth, but what does she want here, and why did he bring her? A man separated from the group. He was perhaps 45, weathered and wide-shouldered with a foreman's posture, the particular way a man stands when he is accustomed to being the authority in the room when the primary authority is absent. "Mr. Callahan," he said. "Walt?" Callahan dismounted. Clara dropped from the horse herself before he could offer assistance, because she had decided that establishing this particular dynamic early was worth the small awkwardness. Callahan noticed. He said nothing which she read as approval. "This is Clara Bennett," Callahan said. "She'll be working here starting today. Work out the details of her assignment with her directly. Her authority on domestic operations is full. Questions about anything else, she comes to me." Walt looked at Clara with an expression she recognized, not hostility, exactly, not contempt exactly. Reservation. Careful, considered professional reservation. "Ma'am?" he said. "Mr. Walt," Clara said. "Just Walt." Then just Clara. Something moved across Walt's face, a small recalibration. He nodded once. Callahan said, "I'll show you the house." He led her toward the main structure, a large, well-built building that showed the marks of a man who had built for function and eventually, reluctantly, for permanence. Clara walked beside him, not behind, and noticed that he matched her pace without comment. "Domestic operations," she said. "That's what you told him. It's what makes sense to start," Callahan said. "You learn the ranch from the inside, they see what you can do, and when it's time to expand your authority, it happens because you've earned it." He glanced at her. Unless you have objections to the strategy. No, Clara said. It's sound. A pause. You've thought about how to introduce this. I've thought about it for 3 days. She stopped walking. He stopped a step later and turned to look at her. 3 days, she said. Yes, you were planning to come to that platform 3 days ago. I was planning to come, he said, when I made up my mind. Which was 3 days ago, after Walt brought me the registration list and I saw your name on it. He held her gaze. 6 prior rejections, 14 months on the territory circuit. I read what the other ranchers filed in their declination reports. Clara felt something cold move through her chest. Those reports are supposed to be private. They are. He didn't look away. I have a particular relationship with the Territory Registrar's office that allows me to read things that are technically private. I won't apologize for that. She held his gaze. Her jaw was tight. What did they say? She asked. That you were difficult, that you argued, that you refused to agree with things you didn't believe were true, that you asked too many questions and answered too directly and had in one man's specific phrasing an excess of opinions for a woman in her position. Callahan's voice was entirely flat as he read these remembered words, the flatness of a man who considers a fact contemptible. 3 of the 6 cited your age. 2 cited prior independent living as evidence of an unformed disposition toward submission. The cold in her chest moved into her hands. And you read those reports, she said, and your response was to come to the platform. Yes? Because you thought those qualities would serve your ranch. Because those qualities, he said, are exactly what any intelligent operation requires, and the fact that 6 men were too threatened by them to see that is their failure of imagination, not yours. He paused. And because a woman who has been told for 14 months that her basic character is a defect and is still standing on platforms, still presenting herself with her head up, that woman has something inside her that I haven't found anywhere else. Clara was very still. You make it sound almost like admiration, she said. I'm practical, he said. Call it what you want. She looked at him for a long moment in the cold October light. Around them, the ranch moved and breathed and carried on 40 men pretending not to watch. Your foreman doesn't like this, she said. Walt will come around. You're very confident about that. I know Walt, Callahan said, and I know you haven't met a problem yet that you left unsolved. Clara looked away from him across the yard, taking in the size of it, the scope of it, the sheer weight of everything that Callahan had built on this land, and was now, for reasons that were either perfectly rational or completely insane, inviting her to be part of. She thought of the platform. She thought of Horace Dunbar's retreating back. She thought of Tom Garrett and his easy posture and his careful accounting of her worth. She thought of $11 and a cracked mirror and a voice in an empty room saying, "This is the last time." She had meant it as resolve. Standing here, it became something else. It became a beginning. Show me the house, she said. Callahan nodded once, and they walked toward it together side by side, while Red Valley Ridge sat 4 miles south and the whole of Wyoming territory spread out in every direction, cold and vast and indifferent, waiting to see what she would do with the first real ground she'd ever been given to stand on. That night, after Callahan had shown her the house and the kitchen and the small room that would be hers, private with a lock on the door, which she noted and did not comment on, and after she had eaten supper alone, because she was not yet certain of the rhythms of this place and didn't want to walk into the bunkhouse dining situation without more information. She sat on the edge of the bed in her locked room and allowed herself to think clearly about what had happened. She had in the course of one afternoon gone from being publicly rejected for the 7th time to riding north with the richest man in the territory to a 40,000-acre ranch where she had been given authority over domestic operations and a private room with a lock. This was either the beginning of the best thing that had ever happened to her, or the beginning of something she didn't yet have words for. She opened her traveling bag and took out the $11 still folded into the small oilskin pouch she kept them in, and she held it for a moment. Then she put it back. She wasn't going to need it tonight. Maybe not for a while. She lay down on the bed without undressing, because old habits die hard, and trust is built slowly, and stealing of the Callahan Ranch, and listened to the sounds of a working place settling into night. The low voices of men, the shift of cattle, the wind finding every crack in the wood. Outside somewhere, Jack Callahan was doing the same, lying in his own room in his own house, carrying whatever it was. He carried the scars he had mentioned on the road without explaining. She would learn those eventually. For now, she had this, a room, a lock and ground beneath her feet that no one had yet told her she couldn't stand on. That was enough. That was more than enough. For Clara Bennett, who had been rejected 7 times and refused to disappear, it was everything. She was awake before the ranch was. That was how Clara had survived every difficult situation in her life, by being the first one up, the first one oriented, the first one to understand the terrain before anyone else was looking. She dressed in the dark, laced her boots tight, and unlocked her door into the main house before the first gray light had touched the windows. The kitchen was cold. She found the wood box, found the stove, found the matches, and had a fire going and coffee on before she heard the first boot hit the bunkhouse floor across the yard. She worked quietly, efficiently, taking inventory as she went. What was here? What was missing? What had been mismanaged and what had been well kept? The kitchen told her things. A kitchen always told her things. This one said, "A man who eats to survive, not to live. Adequate supplies, no waste, no pleasure. Coffee, salt, pork, dried beans, hardtack. Nothing that required patience or care." She found a small cache of dried apples behind the flour barrel and decided without asking permission to use them. By the time Jack Callahan appeared in the kitchen doorway, she had coffee, salt, pork, pan bread, and stewed apples on the table. He stopped in the doorway. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I know," Clara said. "Sit down." He sat. She poured coffee and sat across from him because she was not a woman who served from a standing position if she could help it, and she wanted that established clearly on day one. He looked at the food, then at her. "You found the apples. Behind the flour barrel. They've been there long enough that someone put them there and forgot about them, which means either you don't use this kitchen yourself or you do, and you have no idea what's in it." "Second one," he said. "I thought so." She cut a piece of pan bread. "Your supply order is poorly calibrated. You're buying for volume without accounting for variety. 40 men eating the same 5 things for 6 months don't work as hard as 40 men who eat something worth getting up for." Callahan looked at her over his coffee cup. "You've been here 12 hours. 11, and the kitchen tells you everything about how a place is run." She met his eyes. "You hired me to see things. I'm seeing things." He drank his coffee. "All right, what else?" "The wood box is stacked wrong. Largest pieces on top, which means whoever's filling it doesn't think past the immediate task. Your store's rotation is inconsistent. And someone has been taking small amounts of flour and cornmeal on a regular basis. There's a pattern in how the sacks have been moved and resettled." Callahan's hand stopped with the coffee cup halfway to his mouth. "Taking," he said. "Regularly. Not a lot at a time, but consistently." She held his gaze. "I could be wrong. I'd want to watch the pattern for another few days before I said it with certainty." He set the cup down. His face had gone very still, the stillness she was beginning to recognize as the thing he did instead of displaying emotion. "Who?" "I don't know yet." "But you think you'll know?" "Yes," Clara said simply. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his coffee again and said, 3 months. That's what you asked for." "It is." "I'm starting to think 3 months is going to be very instructive. For both of us," she said. Walt found her after breakfast, when Callahan had gone out to the north pasture and the yard had settled into its working rhythm. He came to the kitchen door, which she had propped open to air the room, and he stood in it with his hat in his hands, a gesture she recognized as deliberate, a man choosing manners as a weapon more subtle than hostility. "Miss Bennett," he said. "Walt." She was scrubbing the pan. She did not stop. "Come in if you have something to say. I don't talk to doorways." He came in, stood in the middle of the room with his hat and his careful expression. He was a man who had run this operation for years, she understood, and the arrival of a woman with undefined authority was a stone in a boot, not catastrophic, but impossible to ignore. "I want to be straight with you," he said. "I prefer that over the alternative," she said. "The men aren't going to take to this easily." "I assumed that. Mr. Callahan's done things his own way for 6 years. The ranch runs well. We don't need—" He stopped himself. "You can say it," Clara said. "You don't need a woman complicating things." "I wasn't going to put it that way. But that's the shape of it." She set the pan down and turned to face him, wiping her hands on the cloth. "Walt, I'm not here to complicate your operation. I'm not here to undermine your authority with the men, or redesign what's working. I'm here because Mr. Callahan asked me to be here, and because certain things in this household need attention that no one's been giving them." She looked at him steadily. "I'm going to do my job. I'd prefer to do it alongside you rather than around you, but I'll do it either way." Walt looked at her. His jaw worked slightly the way a man's jaw works when he's reconsidering something he'd already decided. "The men will test you," he said finally. "Let them. Some of them will be ugly about it. I've handled ugly before." He held her gaze for another beat. Then he settled his hat back on his head, which she recognized as the end of the conversation. "Breakfast was good," he said. "Thank you. First good breakfast this ranch has seen in 3 years." He walked out. Clara turned back to her work and permitted herself the smallest, quietest satisfaction, the kind you can't show anyone, but that sits warm in your chest and keeps you moving. The first test came that afternoon, and it came from a man named Cord. He was maybe 25 broad across the shoulders, with the particular confidence of a young man who had been the strongest person in most rooms he'd occupied and had stopped questioning whether that strength translated to every situation. He came to the kitchen while Clara was inventorying the supply room, and he leaned against the doorframe in the way young men lean when they want to look like they're not trying. "You the new woman," he said, not a question. "Clara Bennett," she said without looking up from her inventory list. "Cord Mackey." He said it like she should know the name. "I've been on this ranch 4 years. Before that, 3 years on the Morrison spread." "That's a solid record," she said. "Mr. Callahan trusts my judgment," Cord said. "Good. So when I tell you something, I'd expect you to listen." She looked up then. He was smiling, not a friendly smile, the kind of smile that's waiting to see what you'll do. "Tell me something then," she said. He pushed off the doorframe and took a step into the room. "This arrangement isn't going to work. Mr. Callahan's a good man, but he made a mistake bringing someone like you out here. The men don't respect it. They're not going to take direction from a woman who was rejected off a platform and got taken in out of charity." The word charity landed where he intended it to land. Clara set down her pencil. She looked at Cord Mackey with the full weight of her attention, which was a considerable weight. "Let me make something clear to you," she said quietly. "Mr. Callahan didn't take me in out of charity. He offered me a position because he assessed that I had skills this ranch needed. I accepted that position with conditions that he agreed to in writing. I am an employee of this ranch with contracted authority over domestic operations." She took one step toward him. "And if you ever use the word charity in reference to my presence here again, you will find that your 4 years of tenure and your solid record with Mr. Callahan do not protect you from a woman who has spent 14 months learning exactly how far her patience stretches and where it ends." Cord stared at her. "Are we clear?" she said. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then something shifted behind his eyes. Not respect, not yet, but the first renegotiation of his estimate of her. He nodded once curtly and walked out. Clara picked up her pencil and went back to her inventory. Her hand was entirely steady. She found the pattern in the flour by the 3rd day. It was Amos, one of the older hands, maybe 55, a quiet man who cooked for himself on nights when the bunkhouse kitchen was too loud. He wasn't stealing for profit. She understood that when she tracked the amounts and the timing small quantities consistent intervals, always around the end of the month. A man managing a secondary mouth somewhere, supplementing something he couldn't request. She brought it to Callahan that evening in his study, where he was reviewing ledger books with the expression of a man who has been reviewing ledger books for so long that the numbers have stopped meaning anything. "Amos," she said, and told him what she'd found. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "His mother. She lives on a small place about 6 miles east. She's old, can't work anymore. He sends her money when he can, but the supply situation—" "He's been taking to feed her," Clara said. "Yes." "And you didn't know?" Callahan looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, something that might have been in another man embarrassment. "No," he said. "I didn't know. He's been doing it for at least 6 months, based on the pattern," she said. "Possibly longer. I should have—" He stopped, started again. "I should have known what was happening with my own men." "You run 40,000 acres, Clara said. "You can't see everything." "That's not an excuse." "No," she agreed. "It's not." She looked at him. "What do you want to do?" He thought about it. "Talk to Amos, increase his wages, set up a monthly supply arrangement for his mother through the ranch." He paused, quietly, without making him feel like a charity case. Clara noted the word choice. "I can handle the supply arrangement," she said, "if you handle the conversation." "Why that division?" "Because a man that private about his need will receive it better from you than from me. He trusts you. I'm still a stranger to him." She paused. "And because what you say to him, and how you say it, will determine whether he stays on this ranch or leaves out of shame. You need to say it right." Callahan looked at her for a long moment. "You've thought about this more than the logistics." "I think about people," she said. "The logistics are the easy part." He held her gaze, and again she saw that thing she couldn't entirely name, the complicated, honest thing that was more than observation and less than declaration. "Clara," he said. She waited. "The men are talking about you," he said. "About why you're here and what you are to this ranch and to me." "I assumed they would be." "Some of it is uncharitable." "I've survived uncharitable," she said. "I know." He leaned back in his chair. "I want you to know that I'm aware of it. That if anyone crosses a line—" "I handle my own lines," she said firmly but without heat. "Mr. Callahan, if I need your intervention, I will ask for it. Until then, I'd prefer to establish my own standing with these men. Interference from you will read as protection, and protection reads as weakness in their eyes." He held her gaze. "You're certain about that?" "Very." He nodded slowly. "All right. And stop calling me Miss Bennett in front of the men," she said, standing to go. "It creates distance that I need them to close. Clara is fine." "Clara?" he said. She stopped at the door. "Thank you," he said. "For Amos." She looked back at him, at this man in his lamplit study, with his ledger books and his 40,000 acres and his 6 years of carrying everything alone. "Thank you," she said, "for listening." She went back to her room and locked the door and sat in the dark for a while, thinking about the particular quality of a man who says all right when he means it. The letter arrived on a Thursday, 8 days after Clara came to the Callahan ranch. It came with the weekly supply wagon from Red Valley Ridge tucked inside the regular mail bundle that Walt sorted on the porch table. Walt brought it to Clara without comment, which told her he'd read the return name and decided handing it over quietly was the right move. The return name was Peters, the territory registrar. She opened it in her room. "Miss Bennett. Pier Territorial Regulation. 14.7. Your registration status has been formally closed following your declination of placement, following the Red Valley Ridge selection event of October 9th. This office wishes to note that the circumstances of your departure from the selection specifically your departure in company with Mr. J. Callahan of Callahan Ranch, who is not a registered selection participant, have been flagged for review. If no formal placement contract is filed with this office within 30 days, your case will be referred to the Territory Welfare Commission. R. Peters, Registrar. Clara read it twice. Then she folded it, set it on her bed, and sat very still for approximately 90 seconds, working through the implications with the systematic calm of a woman who has learned that panic is expensive. Peters was threatening her. Not directly, the language was carefully official, carefully neutral. But the meaning was clear. File a contract proving her arrangement with Callahan was legitimate, or be reported to the Welfare Commission, which had the authority to remove unplaced women from private residences and place them in territory-managed work assignments, which were in Clara's experience and understanding various degrees of miserable. The message underneath the official language was clearer still. Peters knew something, or suspected something, and this was the possibility that tightened the back of her neck. Peters was in communication with someone who had an interest in disrupting this particular arrangement. She thought of Horace Dunbar. Dunbar had been humiliated. Technically, he had turned her down, and she had ended the day riding north with the most prominent man in the territory. That was not a story a man like Dunbar would let sit quietly. She picked up the letter and went to find Callahan. He read it standing. She watched his face while he read, the stillness settling deeper and harder. A different quality of stillness, now the kind that comes before something rather than after it. "Peters," he said. "Yes." Peters has never flagged an irregular departure before. Women leave selections with unregistered men half a dozen times a year in this territory. He set the letter on his desk. Someone put him up to this. "I think so too," Clara said. "My first thought was Dunbar." Callahan's jaw tightened, briefly controlled. "Dunbar has history with this office," he said. "Tell me." He looked at her, appeared to weigh something. Then, 3 years ago, Dunbar made a bid on a tract of land adjacent to my north boundary. I outbid him. He's been looking for leverage against me since then." He paused. "Using you as leverage is exactly the kind of move he'd make." The word "using" hung in the air between them. Clara felt the cold move through her again, but she kept it off her face. "Then we file the contract," she said. "You agreed to 3 months before." "I agreed to 3 months before a formal arrangement," she said. "A work contract is not an arrangement. It's documentation. I am an employee of this ranch, and we put that on paper, and we file it with the registrar's office, and Peters has nothing to hold over either of us." She held his gaze. "That's the practical solution. Clara." He said her name in a particular way, the way that meant he was about to say something more than practical. "If we file a contract, it becomes public record. The territory will know you're here in what capacity, under what terms. That gives Dunbar already knows I'm here," she said flatly. "He's the one who started this. Hiding the contract doesn't protect me. It gives him the exact vulnerability he's looking for." She took a breath. "File the contract. Let him read it. Let the whole territory read it. I am not a woman doing something shameful that needs to be concealed." Callahan looked at her for a long time. "You're not afraid of him," he said. "I'm afraid of a great many things," she said. "Horace Dunbar is not among them." Something changed in Jack Callahan's face then. It was fast, a second maybe less, and she nearly missed it, but she didn't. She had spent her life watching people's faces for the things they didn't mean to show, and what moved across his face in that second was not admiration, was not assessment, was not the practical calculation of a man evaluating a resource. It was something older and less controlled than any of those things. He looked away before she could be certain of it. "I'll have the contract drawn up by tomorrow morning," he said. "I'll want to review it before it's filed," she said. "Of course." She picked up the letter from his desk and folded it and put it in her pocket, because she had a habit of keeping evidence where she could see it. "One more thing," she said. "Yes. When Dunbar pushes back, and he will push back, what does he have access to that could cause real damage to this ranch?" Callahan was quiet for a moment. Land dispute. The north boundary title is clean, but there's a filing from 2 years ago that he could use to initiate a resurvey. It won't hold, but it would take months and cost money. Is there anything else? The pause was slightly longer this time. Water rights, he said. The creek that runs through the south quarter. The original deed has an ambiguity in the water rights language. I've been meaning to have it formally clarified. Clara filed this away. How long has that ambiguity existed? Since I bought the land. And in 6 years you haven't resolved it. It hasn't been pressed. It will be now, she said. Get a lawyer working on it before Dunbar finds it. He looked at her. You think he already knows? I think men like Dunbar do their research before they act, she said. He didn't send Peters after me on impulse. He had a plan when he did it. The letter was step 1. She held his gaze. I'd like to know what step 2 looks like before it arrives. Callahan was quiet for a moment. Then he said something she did not expect. I should have told you about the water rights when you arrived, he said. You're working on this ranch. You had a right to know the vulnerabilities. She held very still. Because he was right, and the fact that he knew he was right and said so without prompting, without being cornered into it, without someone extracting the admission was not a thing she had encountered often in men. Yes, she said simply. I did. I'll tell you the rest, he said. Tonight, if you want to hear it. I want to hear it, she said. She left the study and went back to the kitchen where she had bread rising and stock simmering, and she stood at the work table and let the full weight of what was happening settle over her. She had been on this ranch 9 days. 9 days, and she was already inside a land dispute, a registrar's legal threat, and the private vulnerabilities of a man who had been carrying 40,000 acres of secrets for 6 years. This was not what she had planned for. This was also, she understood with a clarity that surprised her the first time in 2 years that she had felt genuinely necessary to something. Not tolerated, not assessed, necessary. She punched the bread dough down and turned it and told herself that necessary was not the same as safe, and that she should remember that distinction carefully. She told herself that several times. She was not entirely sure she believed it. That evening, Callahan told her about his brother. He told her without preamble the way a man tells something he has decided to tell, not gradually, not with the protective warmth of a story, well practiced, but directly, because the directness was the only way he knew. His brother Daniel had been his partner in the ranch for the first 3 years. They had built it together from a smaller claim, worked it side by side, and it had been in Callahan's telling, which was spare and careful, and only occasionally let something through the best 3 years of his life. Daniel had been killed in a dispute over a fence line with a neighboring rancher named Whitfield. The dispute had escalated the way those disputes do on the frontier, gradually then suddenly, and by the time it was over, Daniel was dead, and Callahan had bought Whitfield out of his claim, and absorbed the land, and never spoken to the surviving Whitfield family since. The water rights issue, Callahan said. The ambiguity in the South Quarter deed. It's from the Whitfield purchase. Daniel handled that transaction. He paused. He was better with contracts than I was, but he died before the deed was fully clarified, and afterward I didn't. He stopped. You didn't want to go back into that paperwork, Clara said quietly. He looked at her. No. Because it was the last thing he worked on. A silence. Yes, he said. Clara said nothing for a moment. She sat across from him in the lamp-lit room, and she let that silence be what it was. A man's grief. 6 years compressed into a single unresolved deed, and she did not try to make it smaller, or more comfortable, or resolve it faster than it needed to be resolved. I'll go through the deed, she said finally, if you can get me the original documents. He looked at her. You can read contract language. I can read, she said, and I'm precise about what words mean. If there's an ambiguity, I'll find it, and then we'll know exactly what Dunbar is working with before he uses it. Callahan reached across the desk and opened the lower drawer. He set a folded document on the table between them, thick paper worn at the creases, the particular texture of something handled many times and then deliberately put away. "I haven't opened that in 4 years," he said. Clara looked at the document. She looked at him. "Do you want to be here when I read it?" He thought about this honestly, visibly, the way he thought about things. "Yes," he said. "Then stay," she said. She opened the deed. They read it together by lamplight, Clara pointing at the language, Callahan explaining the history behind each clause. The two of them building a map of this land together, its legal edges, its vulnerabilities, its long unspoken grief. While outside the Wyoming night closed in around the ranch, and 40 men slept, and the creek ran through the south quarter, and Horace Dunbar sat somewhere in Red Valley Ridge with his plan. Somewhere near the 3rd page, Clara found it. "Here," she said, pointing. "The water rights clause. It says, appurtenant water use consistent with prior occupation." That language is ambiguous because prior occupation could refer to Whitfield's use or to the original territorial grant. Which means if Dunbar files a challenge citing Whitfield's prior use, a territorial court might give it standing. She read further. "But here, there's a secondary clause 3 paragraphs down. All appurtenant rights transferred in full to purchaser upon settlement of final payment." That's a superseding clause. A competent lawyer should be able to argue that it resolves the ambiguity in your favor. Callahan leaned over the document, reading it again. His shoulder was close to hers, not touching, but close enough that she was aware of it. "You found that in 20 minutes, he said. "I was looking for it." Daniel read this document for a week. Daniel was grieving while he read it, she said quietly. That makes everything harder to see. He straightened up, and she felt the slight shift of air as the distance between them returned to professional. He looked at the document, and then at her, and his face did the thing it did, the complicated, controlled thing that showed her enough to know something was there, and not enough to know precisely what. "Clara," he said. "Don't," she said. He blinked. "I haven't said anything." "You were going to say something grateful that would make this strange," she said. "Save it. We have a legal document to deal with, a registrar's letter to answer, and a man in town who is going to push harder before he's done." She stood up. "Be grateful later when there's time for it." He looked at her for a moment. Then the ghost of the almost smile appeared. "All right," he said. She picked up the deed and took it to her room to read again more carefully alone, where no one's shoulder was close to hers, and the lamp was steady, and she could think in straight lines without interruption. She read it twice more. The clause held. His water rights were defensible. She set it down and sat in the quiet for a long time, thinking about a man who couldn't open a document for 4 years because of what it had cost him to get it, and then handed it to a woman he'd known for 9 days because she asked him to. She thought about what that kind of trust costs, and what it means when someone extends it anyway. The fire burned low. Clara sat in the dark of the Callahan ranch with a deed in her hands and a letter in her pocket, and 40,000 acres of someone else's grief laid out around her. And she understood slowly, carefully, with every defense she owned, still firmly in place, that she had stopped thinking of this as someone else's. Somewhere between the flour barrel and the lamplight and a dead man's contract, this land had started to feel like ground she was standing on. Not falling through. Standing on. And for Clara Bennett, who had been standing on borrowed ground her entire life, that was the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to her. The contract was filed on a Friday. Callahan rode into Red Valley Ridge himself to deliver it to the registrar's office, and Clara stayed at the ranch because they had agreed without discussing it at length that her presence in town so soon after the selection would draw the kind of attention that served Dunbar's interests more than theirs. She spent the morning working through the supply inventory she had been building since day one, cross-referencing actual stock against the order records from the past 8 months, and what she found confirmed what she had suspected from the beginning. Someone had been padding the supply orders. Not dramatically, not in a way that screamed theft, but consistently in the particular pattern of a man who understood that small amounts over long periods add up to something significant and are harder to trace than a single large taking. This was different from Amos and his flour. Amos was need. This was calculation. She had the numbers laid out on the kitchen table when Walt came in for the midday coffee, and she turned the ledger to face him without preamble. "Look at this." Walt looked. He was quiet for a long time. She watched his face move through the stages, first reading, then understanding, then the particular discomfort of a man who is realizing something happened under his watch that he didn't see. "How long?" he asked. "At least 14 months based on what I can trace. Possibly longer." She tapped a specific column. "The pattern shifts here, the amounts get smaller and more spread out. Whoever is doing this got careful after something made them nervous. My guess is a spot check, or someone came close to noticing." "Nobody ran a close inventory before you got here," Walt said, and his voice carried something in it, not quite shame, but the neighbor of it. "I'm not saying that to criticize," Clara said. "You run 40 men and 40,000 acres. The kitchen supply ledger is not your primary responsibility." "It should have been someone's." He straightened up. "You know who?" "I have a strong suspicion." She said it carefully. "But I want to be certain before I say the name. I need 2 more days of watching." Walt looked at her. His face had changed since the first morning. Not dramatically, not into warmth, but into the settled acceptance of a man who has revised his estimate and is living with the revision. "You'll tell me when you're certain." "You and Mr. Callahan together," she said, "at the same time. Because however this resolves, you'll both need to know simultaneously. I don't want there to be a version of events where one of you was told before the other." He studied her. "Why does that matter?" "Because it keeps the authority clean," she said. "And because it's fair." Walt was quiet for a moment. "Miss Bennett," he said. "Clara." He corrected himself without being asked. "You've been here less than 2 weeks." 12 days, she said. "In 12 days you found Amos, found this, found the supply rotation problem, and apparently read a deed that Mr. Callahan couldn't open for 4 years. He said it without expression, but the words themselves were enough. What exactly did those 6 men on the selection platform think they were turning down? Clara looked at him. "Their loss," she said, "and my luck." Something moved across Walt's face that was unmistakably the beginning of a smile. He picked up his coffee and walked out without showing it fully, which she appreciated. She was not ready for Walt to smile at her yet. She needed him useful before she needed him friendly. No. Callahan came back from town in the early afternoon, and she knew before he dismounted that something had happened. She knew it from the pace of the horse, too controlled the particular flatness of a rider, keeping himself reined in, and she came out of the house and stood on the porch and waited. He handed the horse off to a hand and came up the porch steps and stopped in front of her. "Peters filed the contract," he said. "Good." "Dunbar was at the registrar's office when I arrived." Clara held very still. "That's not coincidence." "No," Callahan said. "It was not." He moved past her into the house, and she followed and closed the door behind them. In the front room, he took off his hat and set it on the table, and stood with his hands flat on the surface, looking at them. "Tell me," she said. "Dunbar didn't say much. He doesn't in public, he's too careful for that. But he was there, and he saw me file the contract, and he looked at me across Peter's office, and he said very quietly, so only I could hear." Callahan paused. He said, "Interesting choice, Jack. I wonder how long she lasts." The room was very quiet. "That's a threat," Clara said. "That's the shape of one, yes." "What did you say?" Callahan looked up from his hands. "I said, long enough to outlast whatever you're planning, Horace. And then I filed the contract and left." Clara stood across the room from him and thought about Horace Dunbar in a registrar's office, carefully positioned, carefully timed, sending a message without a word that could be held against him. She thought about the water rights deed and the secondary clause and the lawyer Callahan had written to in Cheyenne 3 days ago. She thought about 14 months of padded supply orders and 2 more days of watching she still needed to do. "He's moving faster than I expected," she said. He has reason to, Callahan said. I bought that north tract from under him 3 years ago, and he's been waiting for an opening. He thinks you're the opening. He thinks you made a sentimental decision, Clara said. He thinks you brought in a rejected woman out of some misguided impulse and that she'll either fail on her own or be easy to discredit. She paused. He doesn't know what you actually brought in. Callahan looked at her. That unguarded thing moved across his face again, faster this time there and gone. No, he said. He doesn't. Good, she said. Let's keep it that way for as long as possible. Dunbar working from a wrong assumption is more useful to us than Dunbar, who understands the situation accurately. She moved toward the kitchen. I have something to show you this evening about the supply ledger. But right now I need to finish the bread, and you need to go back out to your men and behave exactly as if nothing happened in town today. He stared at her. Clara, if you come back from Red Valley Ridge looking like a man who's been threatened, your 40 men will know it before supper. And 40 men who know their boss is under pressure make decisions based on that pressure instead of their judgment. She looked at him directly. Go back to work. I'll handle supper. Tonight we talk. He picked up his hat. At the door, he stopped. You know, he said, when I read your declination reports, the ranchers used the word difficult like it was a flaw. It is a flaw, she said, for a man who wants a woman who won't push back. Yes, Jack Callahan said quietly. It is exactly that. He put his hat on and went back to work. She found her certainty about the supply thefts that same afternoon. His name was Virgil Crane. He was 38, one of the longer-tenured hands responsible for the supply wagon runs into Red Valley Ridge, which was, Clara had understood from day one, exactly the position you would want if you were going to pad an order and pocket the difference. He was not stupid. The padding was sophisticated, distributed across enough different line items that no single category looked obviously wrong. But Clara had spent 12 days building a complete picture, and the complete picture was damning. She brought it to Callahan and Walt together that evening, the way she'd told Walt she would, laying the ledger open on the study desk and walking them through it, column by column, without drama, without accusation in her voice, just the numbers and what they meant. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Walt spoke first. Virgil, he said, and the word had the specific weight of a man who had trusted someone and is now holding the cost of that trust. Yes, Clara said. How much total? Callahan asked. Over 14 months accounting for the discrepancies, I can fully document approximately $240. She paused. There may be more from before the period I can trace. $240 was not a catastrophic sum for a ranch the size of Callahan's. But it was not nothing, and more than the money was the implication a man who had been trusted with supply runs and had used that trust as a mechanism methodically for over a year. What do you want to do? Clara asked. She directed it at Callahan, but she looked at Walt too, because this was going to matter to Walt in ways that were different from how it mattered to Callahan. Walt said, "We confront him." Callahan said, "Tonight." "Not tonight," Clara said. Both men looked at her. "Tonight you're both angry," she said. "Controlled but angry. I can see it. If you confront him tonight, he gets defensive, he denies it, and you have a standoff that divides the bunkhouse because Virgil has friends here who've known him longer than they've known me, and they'll have opinions about who brought this forward." She kept her voice level. "Tomorrow morning, early, before the other men are up. Callahan, you, Walt, and Virgil in this room. I'll have the ledger." He looks at the numbers, and he has nothing to say against them, because numbers don't get angry, and numbers don't have loyalty conflicts. She looked at them both. "That's how you resolve it cleanly." Walt looked at Callahan. Callahan looked at the ledger, then at Clara. "You've thought about the after," he said. "I always think about the after," she said. "The confrontation is 5 minutes. What happens in the bunkhouse for the next 2 weeks is what matters." He nodded once. "Tomorrow morning." She closed the ledger and left it on the desk because she trusted both of these men not to move on it tonight, and showing that trust openly was as important as the trust itself. The confrontation with Virgil Crane lasted 11 minutes. Clara had been right about the numbers. Faced with 14 months of documented discrepancies laid out in handwriting that did not belong to any of the three men in the room, Virgil's denial lasted 40 seconds before it collapsed into something more complicated. Not exactly a confession, but a silence that confirmed everything the ledger said. What Clara had not predicted was what came out of that silence. "Dunbar," Virgil said. The name dropped into the room like a stone into still water. "Say that again," Callahan said. His voice was very quiet. Virgil looked at the table. He was a man watching something he'd built fall down around him and calculating rapidly what position gave him the best chance of walking out of here. "Dunbar approached me 8 months ago. He knew about the supply runs. He said—" Virgil stopped, started again. "He said he'd report the shortages to the territorial marshal if I didn't give him information about the ranch, about your operations. Water schedules, herd counts, which pastures you were running, which seasons." The silence in the room was absolute. Clara did not move. She sat with her hands folded on the ledger and watched Callahan's face do the thing it did. The stillness, the deeper and harder stillness, like a man pulling everything inward before it can escape as something he'll regret. "Dunbar has been running a spy on my ranch for 8 months, Callahan said. "Yes, sir." "And you gave him that information." "He had me, Mr. Callahan. He knew about the shortages. If he'd gone to the marshal, you should have come to me." Callahan said it quietly. "The moment he approached you, you should have come to me." Virgil said nothing because there was nothing to say. He had made a choice 8 months ago based on fear and self-preservation, and the choice had compounded itself the way those choices always do, until he was sitting in his employer's study with 3 people looking at him and the whole structure of his deception laid out on a table in front of him. Walt said, "What information did you give him?" "Herd rotation. Water usage on the South Quarter." Virgil looked up briefly. He was asking about the South Quarter specifically, about the creek and the water schedule. Clara looked at Callahan. He looked back at her. The water rights. The ambiguity in the deed. Dunbar hadn't found the vulnerability by accident or by legal research. He'd been fed information about Callahan's operations from inside the ranch, and he'd used that information to identify the exact legal pressure point where the damage would be greatest. This was not an opportunistic attack. This was a campaign. Methodical, patient, 8 months in the making. "Get out," Callahan said to Virgil. "Your wages through today will be left at the gate. Don't come back to this ranch." Virgil stood. He looked like a man who had expected worse and wasn't sure whether the relative mercy of it made him feel better or worse. "Mr. Callahan." "Take your gear and go," Walt said. Virgil went. The 3 of them sat in the study after the door closed and the quiet came back in. Outside, they could hear the normal sounds of the ranch waking up fully into morning boots and voices and the purposeful noise of 40 men who didn't yet know what had just happened 15 feet away from their breakfast. "He knows about the South Quarter deed," Clara said. "Yes," Callahan said. "He's been building this for 8 months. The letter from Peters, the timing at the registrar's office, those weren't opening moves. Those were mid-game moves." She thought through it. He was waiting for something to use as a public lever, something that would make you look. She paused, choosing the word precisely. Impulsive, personally compromised. Callahan looked at her. "You," he said. "Me," she said. "He saw you claim me off that platform or heard about it, and he decided that was the lever. A man making an emotional decision about a rejected woman was easier to discredit than a man running a sound operation." She kept her voice absolutely even. "He's planning to challenge the water rights in court and use your decision about me as character evidence, that you've become unreliable, personally and professionally." The room was very quiet. Walt said slowly, "Can he do that?" "A territorial court will listen to it," Clara said. "Whether it holds is another question. But the process alone costs time and money and reputation." She looked at Callahan. "The lawyer in Cheyenne, how soon?" I wrote 3 days ago. I'd expect a reply within the week. Write again today. Tell him it's urgent. Tell him you need the water rights clarification filed before a challenge can be entered." She paused. "And tell him you may need him to come to the ranch." Callahan looked at her steadily. "You think this escalates?" "I think Dunbar has been patient for 8 months, and he's now moving quickly, which means he believes he has what he needs." She met his eyes. "We need to move faster." He nodded. Then, unexpectedly, "Clara, I owe you an apology." She blinked. "For what?" "For not having done this years ago. The deed clarification, the supply audit, all of it." His voice was measured, but there was something underneath it, something raw and honest, that the control couldn't entirely contain. "Daniel died, and I closed everything down, and told myself the ranch was running fine because it was making money and the cattle were healthy, and—" He stopped. "I missed things. Important things. Because I stopped looking." Clara sat with that for a moment. "Grief does that," she said. "It narrows the field. You see what's in front of you, and you stop seeing the edges." "You saw the edges in 12 days, he said. "I had nothing else to look at," she said. "This ranch isn't my grief. I came in clean." She paused. "That's not a virtue. It's just a different position." He looked at her for a long time. The morning was getting bright beyond the window, and the ranch was fully awake now. And somewhere out in the yard, 40 men were starting their day, without knowing that the shape of this operation had shifted significantly in the past hour. "What do we tell the men?" Walt asked. "The truth," Clara said before Callahan could answer. "That a supply discrepancy was found and addressed. That Virgil Crane is no longer with the ranch. Nothing about Dunbar, not yet. That information creates panic and takes sides." She looked at Walt. "Can you handle the bunkhouse reaction?" "Yes," Walt said. "Then handle it. Today, matter of fact, no drama. By supper, it'll be old news." Walt stood, and he looked at her with his careful, revised estimate face, and he said, "Yes, ma'am." Not Clara. "Ma'am." The shift was small and enormous at the same time, and Clara let it land and nodded once and watched him go. She and Callahan were alone in the study. "He called you ma'am," Callahan said. "I noticed. In 4 years, I've never heard Walt call anyone ma'am who hadn't earned it." "Then I'll try to keep earning it," she said. She stood to go, and he said her name, and she stopped. "Whatever Dunbar does next," Callahan said, "I want you to know that your position here is not contingent on this fight. Your contract is filed. Your wages are guaranteed. If this gets worse before it gets better, that doesn't change." She looked at him. "Is that what you think I'm worried about?" He looked back at her steadily. "I don't know what you're worried about. I'm telling you what I want you to know regardless." "What I'm worried about," Clara said slowly, "is the 16 men in that bunkhouse who've been working beside Virgil Crane for years and are going to spend today deciding what they think about why he's gone." She paused. "Some of them are going to decide it's my fault, that I came here, looked too close, and cost a man his livelihood." "You didn't cost him anything," Callahan said. "He made his own choices." "That's true," she said. "And it won't matter to the men who liked him." She was right. By the afternoon, she could feel it, the particular temperature of a group of men who have chosen a position and are expressing it through the specific silence they use around a person they've decided to hold responsible. Not all 40, not even most. But enough. Maybe 8 or 10, the ones who had known Virgil long and were angry in the unfocused way of people who need someone present to be angry at, since the actual cause of their anger had ridden off the property at breakfast. She moved through her work with the same pace she always used. She didn't avoid anyone. She didn't change her route through the yard, or stop going to the equipment barn for the supplies she needed, or alter any part of how she had been operating for the past 12 days. She showed them the same face she had shown Tom Garrett in the street in Red Valley Ridge, even unhurried, absolutely committed to taking up exactly as much space as she was entitled to. It cost her. She would not have admitted that to anyone, but it cost her. The accumulated weight of being looked at with accusation by men who had decided your guilt before they examined your evidence was a specific and exhausting kind of pressure, and she had been carrying variations of it her entire life. But she did not bend. And then Cord Mackey did something she didn't expect. It was late afternoon, and she was crossing the yard with a bucket of kitchen scraps for the composting pile at the farm, and 3 of Virgil's allies were near the fence. And one of them said something not directed at her technically, but aimed like an arrow and landing where it was intended to land. Funny how a woman shows up and a good man loses his job inside 2 weeks. Clara set down the bucket. She turned to face them all 3 with the full weight of her attention. "Say it to my face, or don't say it," she said. The man who had spoken young, square-jawed the particular belligerence of a person performing his anger for an audience, met her eyes. "I said it." "You said it sideways," she said. "Say it straight." "Fine." He took a step forward. "Virgil worked this ranch 4 years. He was a good hand. And you've been here less than 2 weeks asking questions and going through ledgers and finding $240 missing from the supply accounts," Clara said. "Over 14 months, documented line by line, column by column. You want to see the numbers?" The man stopped. "Virgil made his choices 8 months before I arrived," she said. "He chose to take from this ranch. He chose to give information about this operation to a man who is trying to destroy it. I did not make those choices for him. I found them." She looked at all 3 of them in turn. "I understand you're angry. Virgil was your friend, and now he's gone, and it's easier to be angry at me than at him. That's human nature. But do not confuse the person who found the problem with the person who caused it. Those are different people." The square-jawed man was quiet. From behind her she heard boots on the frozen ground, and then Cord Mackey was standing beside her. Not behind her. Beside. "She's right," Cord said. It was simple and flat, and landed like a hammer. "I didn't like her either when she got here. Still not sure how I feel about all of it. But she's right about Virgil. He made his own bed." The 3 men looked at Cord, then at Clara, then at each other. The square-jawed man picked up the thing he'd set down and walked away, and the other 2 followed, and Clara stood in the yard with the bucket of kitchen scraps at her feet, and Cord Mackey beside her, and she breathed. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Cord said. "I didn't do it for you. I did it because what he said was wrong, and someone had to say so." He paused. "But you handled yourself." "I usually do," she said. He looked at her sidelong. "You know what Virgil said to me when he was packing his gear this morning?" "What?" "He said he figured the new woman would find it eventually. He said—" Cord paused. "He said he'd been waiting for someone to look, and no one ever did, and then you showed up and he knew it was over inside the first week." He shook his head slightly. He wasn't even that angry. He seemed almost relieved. Clara thought about that. About a man who had been carrying a secret for over a year waiting to be caught, and the particular exhaustion of maintaining a deception for that long against the possibility of someone finally paying attention. "Secrets are heavy," she said. "Yes," Cord said. Then, "I told you when you got here that this arrangement wasn't going to work." He said it without looking at her. "I was wrong. She didn't make anything of it." "You were cautious," she said. "That's different from wrong." He looked at her then, and she could see him deciding something, some renegotiation happening behind his eyes, something settling into place. He picked up the bucket and carried it to the composting pile for her, set it down, and walked back to the barn without another word. Clara stood in the yard and felt the temperature of the ranch shift around her, not completely, not permanently, but measurably. The way temperature shifts when a window is opened, not transformed, but different. She went back to the kitchen. The letter from the Cheyenne lawyer arrived 4 days later. His name was Aldrich, and he was precise and economical in his language, which Clara appreciated. He confirmed that the secondary clause in the deed was likely to supersede the ambiguous water rights language and advised immediate filing of a formal clarification with the Territorial Land Office. He also noted, And this was the part that made Clara set the letter down and stand very still for a moment, that a preliminary inquiry regarding the Callahan South Quarter water rights had already been filed by a party whose name he was not yet at liberty to disclose, but which would become public record within 10 days. Dunbar had already moved. She brought the letter to Callahan in the yard where he was working with two hands on a fence repair because she had decided that some information should not wait for the right room. He read it. His face did the stillness. Then he looked up at her. He filed before our clarification. By a matter of days, she said. Aldrich says the clarification can still be filed and should carry more weight than the challenge, but the challenge being first on record complicates the timeline. How long? Months at minimum, possibly through winter. He folded the letter and handed it back to her. What do you need from me? She looked at him, at this man standing in the cold with fence posts and his hands and 40,000 acres of responsibility, asking her what she needed, as if her answer was the natural next step. I need to go to Red Valley Ridge, she said. His eyes sharpened. Why? Because Dunbar filed through someone in that town, a lawyer or an agent or a contact at the registrar's office. And if I can find out who, I can find out what the filing actually says before it becomes public record. She held his gaze. I know people make assumptions about what I can walk into and what I can't. I'd like the chance to prove those assumptions wrong. He was very still. It's not safe, Clara. If Dunbar has contacts at the registrar, Dunbar is managing a legal filing and a business campaign, she said. He's not going to make it personal and physical. That's not his method. She paused. And I have something he doesn't expect me to have. What? The ability to walk into a room and be underestimated, she said. He thinks I'm a rejected woman who got lucky. He'll see me in town, and he'll see confirmation of what he already believes. Her voice was level and certain. Let him. Callahan looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved between them. When? He said. Tomorrow morning, she said. Early. I'll ride with you. No. She said it gently, but absolutely. If you ride with me, it's a statement. It changes what I can do and who will talk to me. I go alone. I'm a woman running an errand. That's worth more than an escort right now. He held her gaze. She could see the fight in him, the instinct that wanted to put himself between her and anything that might harm her. The instinct that was both genuine care and the particular stubbornness of a man who has run his own operation so long that handing off control in any form required a physical effort. All right, he said finally. And then, because she could see what it cost him to say it, thank you, she said, for trusting me. I trusted you on the road out of Red Valley Ridge, he said quietly. I'm just still learning what that means. She didn't answer that. She walked back to the house with the lawyer's letter in her hand, and the cold at her back, and 40,000 acres around her, and she thought about a man still learning what trust means, and a woman who had spent 31 years learning the same thing from the other side. She thought about all the ground that still lay between those two learnings, and she thought for the first time not about whether she should cross it, but about how. She rode into Red Valley Ridge alone on a gray Tuesday morning on the quieter of Callahan's 2 saddle horses with the lawyer's letter folded in her coat pocket and $11 still in her oilskin pouch. Not because she needed them, but because she had decided somewhere around day 15 at the ranch that she would keep carrying them until they stopped feeling like a lifeline and started feeling like a choice. She had dressed carefully. Not to impress, she had no interest in impressing Red Valley Ridge, but to be read correctly. A good wool coat clean. Her hair pinned the way she always pinned it, tight and deliberate. The clothes of a woman with a position, not a woman with a problem. She understood that a town which had watched her get rejected off a platform 3 weeks ago would be looking for evidence of how she had fared since, and she intended to give them an answer that closed the question permanently. The main street was mid-morning busy. She tied the horse at the rail outside the general store and moved through the foot traffic with the unhurried confidence she had been practicing since she was 22, and first learned that confidence worn correctly was the best defense a woman with nothing had against a world that expected her to act like it. She needed 3 things from Red Valley Ridge. First, the name of Dunbar's legal agent, which Aldrich's letter had withheld, but which would be on record at the registrar's office once the filing became public. Second, an understanding of who in this town was aligned with Dunbar, and who was neutral enough to be useful. Third, and most important, she needed to see what Dunbar himself saw her walking through his town alone. A man's reaction to something unexpected tells you more about his strategy than anything he says when he's prepared. She went to the general store first because the general store was always the best place to take the temperature of a town. She bought flour and dried fruit and a small amount of coffee. Legitimate purchases, not extravagant, the supplies of a working household, and she let the transaction be slow and conversational, and she listened. The storekeeper's wife was a woman named May Hensley, perhaps 55, with quick eyes and the practiced friendliness of someone who has spent decades making people comfortable enough to talk. May remembered Clara from the selection. Clara could see it in the slight adjustment of May's expression when she walked in, the recalibration, the update to the information already stored about this particular woman. "Miss Bennet," May said. Then cautiously, "I heard you're out at the Callahan place." "I am," Clara said. "Working there. We're running low on a few things." May began pulling the items from the shelf. "How are you finding it?" "It suits me," Clara said. Simply, with no elaboration, because elaboration invites probing, and she was here to listen, not to defend. "Mr. Callahan's a good man," May said with the careful emphasis of someone making a statement that has more than one layer. "Keeps to himself mostly. His brother's passing was hard on him." "I imagine it was," Clara said. May set the coffee on the counter and looked at her with the directness that older women in small towns sometimes deploy, having reached an age where indirectness costs more energy than it saves. "There's been talk," she said, "about the water rights matter." Clara looked at her. "What kind of talk?" "The filing kind." May's voice was lower now. "Mr. Dunbar's been in here 3 times this past week, talking to people. He's got—" She paused, choosing her words. "He's got a version of things that he's been sharing. About Mr. Callahan making poor decisions lately. About the ranch being mismanaged." "What specific decisions?" Clara said. May held her gaze for a moment. "You understand, I'm not saying I believe any of it." "I understand that," Clara said. "He's saying the decision to bring you out to the ranch was the first sign of it." May said it quietly without apology, because she was a woman who understood that the truth delivered directly is kinder than the truth delivered sideways. That a man who'd choose a rejected woman over running his operation properly has lost his judgment. Clara was quiet for a moment. The store was not empty. 2 other women were browsing the dry goods, and a man she didn't recognize was examining a display of hardware near the door. She kept her face neutral. "And what do the people he's sharing this version with say?" she asked. "Some of them agree," May said honestly. "Some of them don't. But the ones who don't aren't saying so out loud because Mr. Dunbar is. He's the kind of man who remembers who argued with him." "I know the type," Clara said. "I thought you might." May wrapped the purchases in brown paper. "There's one other thing. His legal agent, the man who filed the water rights challenge, is a lawyer named Fitch. Edmund Fitch. He has an office above the barber shop on 2nd Street. He arrived in Red Valley Ridge about 6 weeks ago." She held Clara's eyes. "About 2 weeks before you came to the selection." Clara set her money on the counter slowly. Dunbar had brought in a lawyer specifically for this. 6 weeks before the selection. Before anyone knew Clara would come to Red Valley Ridge, before anyone knew Callahan would make any kind of claim. Which meant the water rights challenge was not a response to Clara's presence, it was pre-existing. Clara's presence was simply the additional lever Dunbar had decided to use when opportunity handed it to him. "Mrs. Hensley," Clara said. "Thank you." "I didn't tell you anything," May said pleasantly, handing over the wrapped parcel. "I just had a conversation with a customer." "Of course," Clara said. She walked out of the general store with her parcel and her new information and the particular focused energy of a woman who has just confirmed that the problem is larger than she thought and is already solving it. She found Edmund Fitch's office without difficulty. She did not go to it immediately. She stood across the street from the barber shop for a few minutes, watching the foot traffic, getting the sense of who went in and out of the building. Then she crossed the street and went up the exterior stairs to the second-floor office and knocked on the door. The man who opened it was perhaps 60, with the well-maintained look of a lawyer who worked for money rather than for justice and had made a comfortable life of it. He looked at her with professional pleasantness and no recognition. "Miss," he said. "Clara Bennett," she said. "I work at the Callahan Ranch. I understand you recently filed a water rights challenge against that property." The pleasant expression didn't waver. Lawyers who worked for men like Dunbar were good at pleasant expressions. "I'm not sure I can discuss active legal matters with me," Clara said, "because I'm not a party to the suit." She looked at him steadily. "You're right that you can't discuss it with me formally. I'm not here formally." She paused. "I'm here to tell you that the Callahan Ranch has retained Arthur Aldrich of Cheyenne, who I believe you've encountered before, and that Mr. Aldrich has already identified the superseding clause in the South Quarter deed that resolves the water rights ambiguity in Mr. Callahan's favor." She watched his face. "I thought you should know that before this goes further. As a professional courtesy." Fitch looked at her. Something shifted behind his professional pleasantness. Not much, but enough. The name Aldrich had landed. She had expected it to. Attorneys who filed challenges on questionable legal ground preferred not to find Aldrich on the other side of them. "You're well informed for a ranch hand," he said carefully. "I'm well informed because I make it my business to be," she said. "Mr. Fitch, I have no quarrel with you personally. You're doing work you've been paid to do. But I want you to understand that the ground you're standing on is less solid than your client has represented to you. The secondary clause is clear. Aldrich will file the clarification this week. When this reaches a territorial judge, and I believe you know it will reach a territorial judge rather than settle, the outcome is not favorable to your client." She kept her voice even and her eyes direct. "I'd encourage you to revisit the strength of the filing." Fitch studied her for a long moment. "Who are you?" he said. Not rudely, genuinely. "I told you," she said. "I work at the Callahan Ranch." "That's not what I mean." "I know what you mean," she said. "Good day, Mr. Fitch." She went back down the stairs. She found out on the street that Dunbar had been watching. Not Dunbar himself, he was too careful for that. But the man he'd sent to watch was not as careful as his employer. And Clara had been paying attention to who was paying attention to her since she walked into town, and the man near the feed store, who had found reasons to stay in her general vicinity for the past 40 minutes, was not someone she recognized as Red Valley Ridge ordinary. She walked past the feed store and turned down the side alley and stopped and waited. And the man came around the corner and pulled up short when he found her standing there looking directly at him. He was young, 20, maybe 22. With the uncomfortable expression of someone caught doing something he was being paid to do, but didn't feel entirely good about. "You can tell Mr. Dunbar," Clara said calmly, "that I spoke to his lawyer, that I made my purchases, and that I'm heading back to the ranch. That's all that happened today. If he wants to know more than that, he's welcome to come ask me himself." The young man stared at her. "Go on," she said. He went. She walked back to her horse tied at the rail outside the general store, and she was untying the reins when she heard the footsteps behind her and turned and found Horace Dunbar himself, standing 6 feet away. He had not sent a message through a proxy. He had come himself. That told her something. Either she had rattled him more than she'd intended, or he wanted to rattle her, and he had decided that the only way to do that was in person. He was a large man, Dunbar. She had watched him from the platform in October without being able to observe him closely, and up close, he was the kind of large that came from decades of authority rather than from physical labor. A man who had been told he filled a room and had started to believe it. "Miss Bennett," he said. "Mr. Dunbar." She did not move from the horse. "You've been busy this morning." I've been running errands, she said. Is that what you call it? He looked at her with the flat assessment of a man who has revised his estimate of someone and is angry about it. I heard you visited Fitch. I did. That was bold. It was informational, she said. I wanted him to understand the strength of Mr. Aldrich's position before this went further. It seemed like the efficient approach. Dunbar looked at her for a long moment. You're smarter than credit for. Most people are, she said pleasantly. His eyes narrowed slightly. You understand what I'm doing here. I understand you have a business dispute with Mr. Callahan over a land boundary from 3 years ago, and you've decided that the water rights filing is your best legal avenue to damage his operation. She paused. I also understand that you've been running a source inside the ranch for 8 months, and that source is no longer there. He went very still. She had not planned to say that. She had planned to be measured and professional and give him nothing. But standing in front of this man, this careful, patient, methodical man who had spent 8 months building a campaign to dismantle something that Jack Callahan had built for 6 years out of grief and stubbornness and love, she had felt a cold, precise anger settle into her chest, and she had decided that letting him know she knew was worth more than the strategic advantage of concealing it. Virgil, Dunbar said. His voice was very flat. Yes, she said. He told you. He told Mr. Callahan. I was present. She held his gaze. You built this on 8 months of inside information, and that information is gone. Whatever you thought you knew about the Callahan South Quarter operation is now 3 weeks out of date at minimum. She tilted her head slightly. And the ranch has had a rather significant operational review in those 3 weeks. Dunbar looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Anger was in it. Yes, but something else. Something that might have been, in another man, a grudging acknowledgement. He chose well, Dunbar said. And it was not a compliment, it was the assessment of a man recalculating. Yes, Clara said. He did. She put her foot in the stirrup and mounted the horse. She looked down at Horace Dunbar standing in the Red Valley Ridge Street, and she said, The water rights filing will fail, Mr. Dunbar. Aldrich will see to that, and when it does, I'd encourage you to let the boundary dispute rest. There's enough land in Wyoming territory for both of you without spending the next 3 years in court. She gathered the reins. Good morning. She rode north out of Red Valley Ridge without looking back, and she did not look back, and she did not hurry, and she kept the horse at the same deliberate, unhurried pace all the way to the edge of town, where the road opened up and the ranch lay 4 miles ahead of her. Then she let the horse run. Callahan was in the yard when she came through the gate, and she knew from his posture that he had been watching for her, though he would not have said so. He came to meet her as she dismounted, and she handed the reins to a hand and turned to face him. Tell me, he said. She told him everything. Standing in the cold yard, she gave him the full accounting, May Hensley Fitch, and his reaction to Aldrich's name, the watcher Dunbar had sent, and the conversation with Dunbar himself. She told it in order precisely without editorializing, and when she finished, she took the brown paper parcel of supplies from the saddlebag and held it out to him, which was not strictly logical, but felt like the right conclusion to the report. He took the parcel. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, You told him we know about Virgil. Yes. I would have kept that back, he said. Not criticism, just fact. I know, she said. I decided the value of him knowing we know was greater than the value of him not knowing. He'll spend time now trying to figure out what else we know and how much Virgil said, and that time is time he's not spending on the legal filing. She paused. I might be wrong, but it felt right in the moment. What did his face do when you said it? Callahan asked. It went still, she said, the way yours does. Something moved across his face. I didn't know I did that. You do, she said. When something matters, you go very quiet. It's how I know I'm saying something you're actually hearing. He looked at her with an expression she had no category for, yet something that was past the practical and hadn't arrived anywhere she had words for. Write to Aldrich today, she said before he could say whatever was behind that expression. Tell him about Fitch's reaction to his name, and tell him we have direct confirmation that Dunbar's inside information source has been cut off and the source is willing to testify to the contact if it comes to that. Virgil would testify. I think Virgil would do almost anything at this point to reduce his culpability, she said. Walt agrees. We talked yesterday. Callahan looked at her steadily. You and Walt talked about using Virgil as a witness yesterday. Yes. And you didn't mention it to me. I was still working out whether it was viable, she said. Now I think it is. He was quiet for a beat. Clara, at what point does the decision get brought to me before it's made? She met his eyes. She understood the question, not anger, not quite, but the particular friction of a man who is accustomed to being the final authority and is discovering that authority shared is not authority halved, but is still undeniably changed. When it affects the operation directly, she said. When it requires your legal authority, or your resources, or your name. This was information gathering. She paused. But if that line isn't where you'd draw it, tell me where you'd draw it. He held her gaze. I'd draw it here, he said. The point where you're talking to my foreman about using one of my former hands as a legal witness that's inside the line. She considered this. Fair, she said. I'll bring it to you first next time. Thank you. They stood in the yard with the parcel of supplies between them and the cold and the whole of the Callahan operation stretching out around them. And Clara thought about the particular negotiation happening between two people who were both accustomed to making decisions alone and were learning slowly and imperfectly to make them together. Aldrich, she said. Today. Today, he agreed. Ned. The letter from Aldrich came back within the week faster than she had expected, and it came with news that shifted everything. Aldrich had filed the water rights clarification with the Territorial Land Office. He had also acting on information Clara had included in Callahan's second letter, researched Edmund Fitch's recent filings across the territory, and what he had found was this Fitch had filed identical or near-identical water rights challenges on 3 other properties. In the past 18 months, all of them adjacent to Dunbar's existing holdings, all of them filed shortly before Dunbar made a significantly below-market purchase offer to the affected landowner. It was a pattern. A deliberate, systematic pattern. File a challenge. Create legal uncertainty. Wait for the pressure to build. Make an offer that looks like rescue. Dunbar was not just fighting Callahan over an old boundary dispute. He was running a land acquisition campaign across the territory using legal pressure as a foreclosure tool, and the Callahan South Quarter was one piece of a larger map. Clara read Aldrich's letter 3 times at the kitchen table before she brought it to Callahan. She read it with the careful attention she gave to anything that had more than one layer, turning each piece of information over, checking what it implied against what it stated, making sure she had the full shape of it before she put it in someone else's hands. The full shape of it was this: Dunbar was not just dangerous to Callahan. He was dangerous to every landowner in that territory who had a vulnerability he could identify and a property he wanted. The 3 other challenges Aldrich had found were properties where the owners had sold to Dunbar at reduced prices rather than fight the legal process. 3 families off their land. 3 operations absorbed into Dunbar's holdings. She brought the letter to Callahan. She watched him read it. She watched the stillness come in and deepen and become the particular quality of stillness that comes before something significant, not anger, past anger, something colder and more purposeful. 3 other properties, he said. That Aldrich found, she said. There may be more. He set the letter down. Do you know the families? Not personally. Aldrich names them in the letter. He was quiet. Then, this isn't just about the ranch. No, she said. It hasn't been for a while. He looked at her. If we take this to the territorial marshal, if we present Aldrich's documentation of the pattern, it becomes a territorial matter, she said, not a property dispute between 2 ranchers, a systematic fraud case. She paused. Which is both more powerful and more dangerous. Dunbar has connections in this territory that run deeper than one lawyer and one registrar. I know his connections, Callahan said. Then you know what we're deciding if we decide to push this further. He looked at her across the desk, and she saw him doing what she had watched him do a dozen times now. The full weighing of a thing, no shortcut, no performance of certainty he didn't feel. What do you think? He said. She had been waiting for someone to ask her that question her entire life. Not what do you recommend or what's your analysis, but simply directly, what do you think? As if her thinking was the natural and appropriate next piece of the conversation. I think Dunbar is going to keep doing this, she said, to other people, to families who don't have an Aldrich or a detailed ledger or someone who knows how to walk into a lawyer's office and read a reaction. She kept her voice even. I think if we have the documentation to stop it, and we don't use it because it's complicated, then we are partly responsible for what he does next. Callahan held her gaze. I also think, she said, that this will be a long fight, and it will be costly, and it will get worse before it gets better, and you should make that decision knowing all of that. We, he said. She blinked. What? You said we are partly responsible. His voice was quiet. You said we should make that decision. She held very still. Yes, she said. He nodded. Once. The way he nodded when something was decided. Write to Aldrich. Tell him to prepare the documentation for the marshal's office. Tell him we'll come to Cheyenne to meet with him in person. We, she said. You should be in that meeting, he said. You know the supply ledger, the Virgil documentation, the pattern in the filings better than I do. Aldrich needs to hear it from you directly. She looked at him. That's a significant trip. Yes, he said. I know. She understood the weight of what he was saying. A trip to Cheyenne together was not a supply run. It was a statement about what she was to this ranch, to this man in the eyes of the territory. It was the opposite of a secret. My contract covers my role here, she said carefully. A trip to Cheyenne to meet with a territorial lawyer about a fraud case is somewhat outside that contract. I'll amend the contract, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Jack, she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. She heard it happen and did not take it back. He heard it too. He didn't move, didn't react in any way that would have been visible to someone watching, but she knew him well enough now to know that it had landed. Clara, he said. I want to be sure we're clear about what this is, she said. Not what it looks like to the territory, not what Dunbar will say about it. What it actually is. She held his eyes. I came here as an employee. I've been doing a job. I've been doing it because it needed to be done and because I'm good at it. That's true. She took a breath. But somewhere in the past 3 weeks, it stopped feeling like someone else's operation. He was very still. I need you to know that, she said. Before we decide to go to Cheyenne together, before anything else changes, I need you to know that I'm not going because it's in my contract. I'm going because I care about what happens to this ranch. A pause. And I need you to tell me if that's a problem. Callahan looked at her across the desk, across the lamp and the letter, and the documented evidence of everything they had built in 3 weeks out of suspicion and practicality, and something that had been trying to be honest with itself since a cold road north of Red Valley Ridge. It's not a problem, he said. His voice was quiet and certain, and it had nothing of performance in it. It's the first thing in 6 years, he said, that hasn't felt like one. The fire in the study shifted and settled. Outside the ranch went on doing what it did 40 men and 40,000 acres, and the creek running through the south quarter that they were fighting for. The night was cold and Wyoming-wide, and indifferent to whatever was happening in this room between these two people. But in the room, something had changed. Not dramatically. Not with any of the language of romance that Clara had been suspicious of her entire life. But in the way that real things change slowly visibly, the way ground shifts when the frost finally gives way, and the earth beneath it begins quietly and without ceremony to thaw. She picked up the letter. I'll write to Aldrich tonight, she said. Tonight? He agreed. She stood. At the door she stopped because she was still learning that some moments deserved to be completed before she walked out of them. "Jack," she said, without turning around. "Yes." "Thank you," she said, "for coming to that platform." A long silence. "Thank you," he said, "for still being on it." She went to her room and wrote the letter to Aldrich, and her handwriting was steady the entire time, and she did not allow herself to feel anything she couldn't name yet. And she felt it anyway. The particular warmth of a woman who has been standing in the cold for a very long time, and has just without entirely meaning to come in out of it. She sealed the letter. She sat in the quiet of the Callahan Ranch with the water rights case and the fraud documentation and the trip to Cheyenne all laid out ahead of her, and she thought about what Jack Callahan had said. The first thing in 6 years that hasn't felt like a problem. She pressed her hand flat against the sealed envelope and thought about all the things that were still ahead of them. The marshal's office, the territorial court, the fight that would get worse before it got better, the 40 men and the 40,000 acres, and the long Wyoming winter closing in. She thought about all of it, and she was not afraid. The road to Cheyenne took 2 days. They rode the first day mostly in silence, which was not the silence of people who had nothing to say, but the silence of people who had learned that the other person didn't require noise to feel accounted for. Callahan rode beside her, not ahead, not behind, and Clara noticed it, without commenting on it, the way she had learned to notice the things he did that he never announced. Walt was running the ranch in their absence. She had left him with a full written accounting of every open matter, the supply rotation schedule, Amos's monthly arrangement, the 2 pasture decisions that needed to be made by Thursday, the name of the hand she suspected was coming down with a lung illness and needed to be watched. Walt had taken the papers and read through them without speaking, and then said, "You'll be back by Friday." And when she said yes, he had simply nodded and gone back to work, which was the closest thing to a blessing she was going to get from Walt, and she received it as such. The night between the 2 riding days, they stopped at a way station where there were 2 rooms, and Clara took one and Callahan took the other, and they ate supper at the common table with 3 other travelers and spoke about practical things. The case, Aldrich's instructions, the documentation she was carrying in the saddlebag, and when she went to her room, she sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself carefully to understand the full weight of what she was doing. She was riding to Cheyenne with Jack Callahan to present evidence of a territorial fraud case to one of the most respected lawyers in Wyoming. 3 weeks ago, she had been standing on a platform in Red Valley Ridge with $11 and a traveling bag. The distance between those 2 points was not geographic. It was everything she had done since every early morning, every confrontation, every line in a ledger, every decision made from the ground up. She had not gotten here by being chosen. She had gotten here by working. The choosing had opened a door. What she had done with the door was entirely her own. She lay down and slept, and in the morning she was up before the way station stirred. And when Callahan came to the common room, she had coffee waiting, and he sat across from her and drank it, and said nothing for a while, and then said, "Did you sleep?" "Enough," she said. "You, some." He turned the cup in his hands. "I was thinking about what you said, before we left, about caring what happens to the ranch." She waited. "I've been thinking about it since you said it," he said. "About what that means. About what I want it to mean." He looked at her directly the way he always looked at things he was not going to look away from. "I don't want to misread what you said." "You're not misreading it," she said. He held her gaze. "Clara, I want to be careful here. Not because I'm uncertain. Because you asked me at the beginning for time before anything changed. And I want to respect that." She looked at him across the table in the early morning quiet of the way station, this man who had read her declination reports and come to a platform and accepted every condition she set without argument, and then spent 3 weeks watching her work, and told her quietly that she was the first thing in 6 years that hadn't felt like a problem. "The 3 months were to protect me from a decision made under pressure," she said, "not from a decision made clearly." He held very still. "I'm making this one clearly," she said. The way station was completely quiet around them. The fire in the hearth, the early gray light at the window, 2 cups of coffee. "All right," Jack Callahan said, and that was enough. For now, it was entirely enough. Arthur Aldrich met them at his office in Cheyenne the following morning, and he was everything his letters had suggested, compass with the eyes of a man who had spent 40 years finding the exact word and using it, rather than the approximate one. He looked at Clara when Callahan introduced her, and his look was the quick, complete assessment of a man who has encountered competence often enough to recognize it on sight. "You're the one who found the secondary clause," Aldrich said. "Yes," Clara said. "And the supply ledger documentation?" "Yes." "And you spoke directly to Fitch?" "I did." Aldrich looked at Callahan. "I understand why you brought her." "I brought her," Callahan said, "because she knows this case better than I do." Aldrich nodded once and opened the file on his desk, and they got to work. The meeting lasted 4 hours. Clara had organized the documentation she was carrying supply ledger Virgil's timeline, the dates of Dunbar's contact with Fitch, cross-referenced against Aldrich's filing records for the 3 other properties into a clear sequential account that Aldrich could take directly to the territorial marshal's office. She walked him through it, piece by piece, answering his questions, precisely flagging where the evidence was solid and where it was inferential, and where she thought more documentation was needed. Aldrich stopped her twice to make notes. The second time he stopped and looked up from his notes and said, "Where did you learn to do this?" "Do what?" she said. "Present evidence," he said. "Distinguish inference from fact. Know what a lawyer needs versus what a client thinks a lawyer needs." Clara paused. "I've been managing difficult situations with incomplete resources for most of my life," she said. "You learn to be precise about what you actually know versus what you're hoping is true." Aldrich looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Callahan. Then he went back to his notes. By the end of the 4 hours, they had a strategy. Aldrich would present the pattern evidence, the 3 prior properties, the filing timeline, the connection between Fitch's challenges and Dunbar's subsequent purchase, offers to the territorial marshal as grounds for a fraud investigation. The water rights clarification for the Callahan property would be filed simultaneously, removing the immediate legal pressure while the larger investigation was initiated. Virgil Crane's testimony, if he agreed, would corroborate the inside operation and establish that Dunbar's method included active corruption of ranch employees. "This will take time," Aldrich said. "A territorial fraud investigation is not quick. Dunbar has resources, and he'll use them." "I know," Callahan said. "He'll also retaliate," Aldrich said. "Not physically, he's too careful for that. But legally, socially. He'll make noise in this territory about your judgment, about your operation, about—" He looked at Clara briefly. "About the choices you've made recently." "He's already making that noise," Clara said. "It hasn't changed anything material." Aldrich looked at her. "It may get louder." "Let it," she said. Aldrich held her gaze for a moment. Then he closed the file. "I'll have the marshal's documentation ready within the week," he said. "I'll send word when it's filed." He stood and extended his hand to Callahan, and then to Clara, and when he shook hers, he held it a beat longer than courtesy required. "Miss Bennett," he said, "for what it's worth from someone who spent 40 years in territorial law, what you did in that supply room and with that deed is the kind of work that saves operations, and the people in them." Clara shook his hand and said thank you, and walked out of the office into the Cheyenne Street with Callahan beside her, and she breathed the cold air and let Aldrich's words settle somewhere they could be real, rather than something she was still deciding whether to believe. "He doesn't say things like that often," Callahan said. "I got that impression," she said. They were quiet for a moment on the busy street. "Clara," he said. "Yes. When we get back to the ranch," he said. "I want to talk about the contract." She looked at him. "What about it?" "I want to amend it," he said. "Not to change your protections, those stay exactly as you specified them, but the title. The role description. He paused. What you're doing at that ranch is not domestic operations. It hasn't been for 2 weeks. I want the document to reflect what you actually are. And what is that? She said. He looked at her in the Cheyenne street with the noise of the city around them and Wyoming territory stretching out in every direction, and he said, a partner. Clara stood with that word. Not employee, not placement, not wife, not charity, not any of the words that had been applied to her on 6 different platforms in 6 different towns. Partner. All right, she said. That's all? He said. Just all right. What else do you want me to say? The ghost of the almost smile. Nothing, he said. All right is perfect. They rode home on a Thursday, arriving at the ranch in the late afternoon, and the first thing Clara noticed when they came through the gate was that something was different. She noticed it before she could articulate it, a change in the temperature of the yard, the way the men moved, the specific quality of the quiet, that was not the ordinary quiet of an afternoon's work. She had lived inside this operation long enough to know its rhythms, and this was not its rhythm. Walt came to meet them before they had fully dismounted. His face told her it was serious before his mouth opened. What happened? Callahan said. Dunbar came, Walt said. The word went through Clara like cold water. Here. Callahan's voice was very quiet. He came to the ranch. Yesterday afternoon. With 2 men I didn't know them. And Peters. Walt's jaw was tight. He said he was here on official territorial business. Peters had papers. What kind of papers? Clara said. Walt looked at her. A secondary challenge. Not the water rights he dropped that or said he was dropping it. This was a residency challenge, against you. She held very still. Against me, she said. Citing Territorial Regulation 14.7, Walt said. The same one Peters used in the first letter. He's claiming that your presence at the ranch as an unregistered placement. His words violates the terms of the work contract because the contract was filed by a party with a financial interest in an active territorial dispute. He paused. He's saying the contract is invalid. The contract was invalid. Clara did the math rapidly. If the contract was invalid, her legal status at the ranch collapsed. She was no longer a documented employee with contracted protections. She was an unplaced woman in a private residence, which put her directly under the territory's Welfare Commission authority, the authority that could remove her from the property and place her in a territory-managed situation. Dunbar had not come after the water rights. He had come after her, because she was the piece that Jack Callahan had not been expecting to have to protect when this started, and Dunbar had decided that removing her was faster and cleaner than fighting a territorial fraud case with Arthur Aldrich on the other side of it. Where are the papers? She said. Walt produced them from his coat. She took them and read them in approximately 90 seconds because she had learned to read legal documents fast. Then she read the specific clause Dunbar was citing, and she read it again, and something settled into place behind her eyes, cold and precise and very clear. He's wrong, she said. Clara, Callahan started. He's wrong, she said again firmly. Regulation 14.7 applies to unregistered placements where the sponsoring party has a direct financial conflict in an active court proceeding. The water rights clarification has been filed, but the challenge has not yet been formally scheduled for hearing. It is not, as of today, an active court proceeding. She looked at Callahan. When Aldrich files the marshal's documentation, that changes. But right now, today, there is no active proceeding. Walt was looking at her. You're sure about that reading? I'm sure, she said. And Aldrich can confirm it in writing by the end of the week. She looked at the papers again. Dunbar pushed this before the marshal's filing because he knew that once the fraud investigation is official, the legal landscape changes, and this challenge becomes much harder to construct. He's racing the clock. Which means we have a window, Callahan said. A narrow one, she said. We need Aldrich to confirm the regulation reading in writing, and we need it filed as a formal response to these papers, before Dunbar can get a Welfare Commission officer to act on them. She calculated. 3 days, maybe 4. I'll ride to Cheyenne tonight, Callahan said. Send a wire, Clara said. Faster. Tell Aldrich exactly what I told you, the active proceeding argument, the filing status, the timeline. He'll know what to do. She handed the papers back to Walt. Keep these. Don't let them leave the property. Walt took the papers and looked and then at Callahan, and the look had something in it she hadn't seen from Walt before, not just the revised estimate, not just professional respect, but the particular expression of a man who has decided fully and without reservation where he stands. I'll keep them, Walt said. Callahan sent the wire within the hour. Aldrich's response came back the following morning, and it confirmed everything Clara had argued. The regulation did not apply to the contract's current status. The challenge was procedurally premature, and Aldrich was prepared to file a formal objection that afternoon that would effectively freeze Dunbar's Welfare Commission action before it could be executed. But the wire also contained something else. Aldrich had filed the marshal's documentation the morning they left Cheyenne. He had not waited for the end of the week as planned. He had moved immediately because he had received information from a source in the territorial capital that Dunbar was about to escalate. The fraud investigation was now officially open. Dunbar's activities across the territory, the 3 prior properties, the Fitch connection, the Virgil arrangement were on record with the marshal's office. Dunbar knew, and Dunbar, rather than retreating, had come to the ranch. Because this was what men like Dunbar did when cornered, they attacked the most vulnerable point they could find, and the most vulnerable point was not 40,000 acres or a water rights deed. It was a woman whose legal standing was 3 weeks old, and whose contract could be questioned by someone with enough connections in the right offices. Clara read Aldrich's wire at the kitchen table and felt the full shape of it the whole campaign from the beginning, every move and countermove, and she was not afraid of it. She was not even particularly angry at it. She had a clear-eyed understanding of how this worked. A powerful man threatened had chosen to come after her because he believed she was the softest target available. He had made that assessment about her once before, on a selection platform in October, looking at a woman who had been rejected 7 times. He had calculated that she was too broken and too desperate to be anything other than an embarrassment to the man who had chosen her. He had been wrong then. She picked up the wire and went to find Callahan. The wire from Aldrich did what it needed to do. By Friday, Dunbar's Welfare Commission challenge had been frozen pending Aldrich's formal objection. By the following Tuesday, the objection had been upheld. The contract stood. Clara's position at the Callahan Ranch was legally unassailable. The news spread through Red Valley Ridge faster than weather, and with it, the other news, the fraud investigation. Dunbar's pattern across the territory, the 3 families whose properties he had acquired through legal pressure. May Hensley at the general store heard it first and made sure everyone else heard it second. Peters, the registrar, went very quiet and began reviewing his own files with an urgency that suggested he was trying to determine exactly how far his cooperation with Dunbar had extended and how much of it was on record. Cord Mackey heard it in town on a supply run and came back to the ranch and told Walt, who told Callahan, who was already aware because Aldrich had sent a detailed update. But the way Cord told it mattered with a particular satisfaction, the satisfaction of a young man who had changed his mind about something and was glad of it. Town's talking. Cord reported at supper to the general table in the way that information travels when a bunkhouse has decided something is worth sharing. They're saying Dunbar's going to have to answer for what he did to those other families. The Garrity place, the McAuliffe farm, those people lost their land to him. He shook his head. That's not a business dispute. That's stealing. The table was quiet for a moment. Then an older hand named Perkins said, "How'd it come out, the investigation?" Miss Bennett found the pattern, Cord said. He said it plainly without flourish, the way you state a fact that doesn't need decoration. She found it in the filings, and she took it to the lawyer in Cheyenne. Clara, who was eating at the far end of the table, She had started eating with the men 10 days ago at Walt's quiet suggestion because integration happened faster around food than anywhere else, did not look up from her plate. But she heard it. She heard her name said at that table the way you say the name of someone who belongs there. After supper, when the men had cleared out and she was washing up, Walt came into the kitchen and stood in the doorway the way he had on that first morning, except now there was nothing careful or reserved about his expression. "You know what you did?" he said. It wasn't a question. "I did my job," she said. "You did more than your job," he said, "and you didn't do it to prove anything. You just did it." He paused. "That's rarer than it should be." She set down the cloth. "Walt, I want to ask you something directly." "Ask." "When I first came here, you were skeptical, rightfully. And you came around, and I understand that and I appreciate it." She looked at him. What changed? What was the specific moment? He thought about it. Actually thought, which she respected. "The Amos situation," he said. "The way you handled it. You found something that would have been easy to make into a punishment, and you made it into a solution instead." He paused. "And you didn't do it to make yourself look good. You didn't report it to Mr. Callahan first to make sure you got credit. You just solved it the right way." She held that. "You've seen a lot of bad management," she said. "I've seen people who do the right thing so that someone notices them doing it," Walt said. "That's not the same as doing the right thing." She went back to the dishes, and he went back to the yard, and she thought about what 31 years of being told she was difficult had actually been 31 years of being around people who wanted the performance of the right thing rather than the thing itself, and finding it impossible to give them what they wanted. She had not changed. The context had. That was everything. The day Horace Dunbar formally withdrew his challenges, all of them, the water rights filing and the residency challenge and a smaller claim against the north boundary that Clara hadn't even known existed until Aldrich mentioned it in passing. The withdrawal landed in the ranch in the form of a single wire from Aldrich, 3 sentences, which Callahan read and then handed to Clara without comment. She read it. She set it on the desk. "It's not over," she said. "The fraud investigation continues regardless of what he withdraws." "I know," Callahan said. "Those 3 families still lost their land." "Aldrich says the investigation may give them grounds to recover it," he said. "It won't be fast, but it's possible." She nodded. She stood by the window and looked out at the yard at the ranch that she knew the weight of now, every supply line and pasture rotation and difficult personality and unspoken loyalty, the whole living organism of it that she had spent 5 weeks learning from the inside out. "Jack," she said. "Yes." "The 3 months," she said. "They're not up yet." "No," he said. "There are 6 weeks left." "I know." She turned from the window to face him. "I want to talk about what comes after them." He stood across the room from her, and she could see him holding himself very still, the way he held himself still when something mattered. "I made conditions," she said. "Time before any formal arrangement. Freedom to leave. Financial independence. You agreed to all of them." "I did," he said. "Those conditions were designed to protect me from making a decision before I understood what I was deciding." She looked at him directly. "I understand now." He crossed the room. He stopped 3 feet from her, and she looked up at him. She had never quite registered how much taller he was until this moment, standing this close, which told her something about how the preceding 5 weeks had recalibrated her awareness of him as a specific person rather than a practical arrangement. "What do you understand?" he said quietly. "That this ranch is real work that I am good at," she said. "That you are a specific and imperfect man who tells the truth and keeps his word, and who trusted me with a 4-year-old grief in the 2nd week of our acquaintance. That I have not woken up once in this place wanting to leave." She paused. "And that the thing I was protecting myself from making a decision under pressure is not what is happening here." "No," he said. "It's not." "I want to stay," she said. "Not as an employee, not as a placement. As a partner who is also, if you still mean what you said on the road to Cheyenne, the other thing." I mean what I said, he said. Then I'm staying. He reached out and took her hand, not dramatically, not with any of the gestures that belonged to a different kind of story. Simply took her hand the way a man takes something he intends to keep and held it, and she let him. Clara, he said. Yes, I chose you on that platform, he said. In front of every person in Red Valley Ridge. I'd choose you again tomorrow, in front of every person in Wyoming Territory if that's what it took. She looked at him steadily. You don't have to choose me in front of anyone, she said. I don't need witnesses. I know you don't, he said. That's not who this is for. She understood then. The choosing the public, claiming the declaration in the street, it was not for her validation. She had never needed validation from Red Valley Ridge. It was for the record. It was Jack Callahan putting his name next to hers in the only accounting that mattered to him, the one where she was not the woman who had been passed over and settled for, but the woman he had seen clearly and pursued specifically, and was proud to be standing next to. It was the difference between being chosen and being claimed. She had spent 31 years knowing she was worth choosing. She had never until this man on this road in this territory been claimed. All right, she said. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried in front of people, even people she trusted. But her hand tightened on his, and he held on without making anything of it, and they stood in the study of the Callahan Ranch, while the winter light came through the window and the ranch went on around them. But the amendment to the contract was drawn up the following week. Aldrich handled it long distance, and it was thorough and clean and protected every provision Clara had originally demanded while adding what Callahan had specified: the title, the formal partnership recognition, the legal standing that made her not an employee of the Callahan Ranch, but a co-principal of it. She read it 3 times. Then she signed it. Then the men called her to the yard, all 40 of them. Walt had organized it without telling her, which she suspected meant he had been planning it since before she signed the document. They stood in the yard in the cold, all 40 from Cord in the front to old Perkins in the back, and Amos beside him, all of them, in the particular posture of men who have decided to do something they are slightly embarrassed about and are going to do it anyway. Walt held a coffee cup out to her. Ranch tradition, he said. New partner gets welcomed formally. Coffee and a handshake from every man. She took the cup. She looked at 40 men in the cold winter air of the Callahan Ranch and felt something move through her that she had no name for, and did not try to name something too large and too complicated and too long in coming to be reduced to a word. She shook 40 hands. Cord's was first, he made sure of that, stepping to the front, and when he shook her hand, he said quietly, I was wrong when I said this wouldn't work. And she said, you were cautious. And he said, you said that already. And she said, it's still true. Amos's hand was last. He shook hers, and held it, and looked at her with eyes that were doing something complicated behind their surface, and he said, thank you, Miss Clara, for how you handled my situation. Clara, she said. Clara, he said. And he let go. She turned to find Callahan standing at the edge of the group, watching. He had watched the whole thing without participating, because it was not for him to participate in this, was the men's gesture their accounting, and he understood that. He had the ghost of the almost smile on his face, the one she had been watching almost appear since the road out of Red Valley Ridge, and for the first time, it arrived completely. She crossed the yard to him with the coffee cup still in her hand. All 40, she said. All 40, he said. Walt planned this. Walt has been planning this since the Virgil situation, Callahan said. He was waiting for the right moment. It's a good moment, she said. Yes, he said. It is. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and behind them 40 men dispersed back to their work with the specific efficiency of people who have done what they came to do and have no interest in being sentimental about it longer than necessary. Because sentiment is not the currency of a working ranch, and they were all working people. But they came back to a kitchen that was hers, and ate food she had made, and worked land that she co-owned, and lived inside an operation that her hands were in at every level, and that was the real accounting. Not the ceremony, the daily weight of it. That was what belonging looked like. Not a platform, not a selection, not a man choosing you in public while a town watched. 40 handshakes in the cold, a contract with your name in the right place, a ranch that knew your footstep before it saw your face. This was what Clara Bennett had built in 5 weeks out of $11 and a traveling bag, and 31 years of being told she was not enough. She had not waited to be saved. She had walked through an open door and built something worth staying for. And on the Callahan Ranch in the Wyoming Territory, in the winter of 1883, with 40,000 acres around her and one man's hand finding hers in the cold, Clara Bennett, who had been rejected 7 times and refused to disappear, was no longer the woman no one wanted. She was the woman the richest cowboy chose, and she had chosen him right back, on her own terms, with her eyes wide open. That was the end of the story of Clara Bennett and the beginning of everything else.